Tonight, Washington just hit Minnesota with a financial stop sign, and the way this story is being sold to you is already splitting into two extremes. Either this is a heroic fraud crackdown, or this is cruelty, politics, and punishment. Here's the problem with both. If you care about accountability, if you care about taxpayer money, and you also care about protecting patients, you cannot afford to get this wrong. This is Grant Caldwell, and this is the Grant Caldwell Report. In the next 60 seconds, I'm going to walk you through exactly what's confirmed, what's being claimed, and the one detail most coverage is skipping that changes how this unfolds. Stay with me, because once you see how these pieces connect, the entire situation looks very different. Here's what we know. The Trump administration says it is temporarily pausing roughly $250 million in federal Medicaid payments to Minnesota, and it's demanding a corrective action plan within 60 days. Now, the first thing you need to understand, and many headlines bury, is what kind of money this is. Federal officials describe it as deferred reimbursement. In other words, Minnesota pays providers, then seeks federal matching funds, and this is the federal side holding back part of that match while it says it investigates questionable claims and waits for a plan. That distinction matters, because if this is deferred reimbursement, the immediate pressure isn't a doctor turning off the lights tomorrow morning. The immediate pressure is on Minnesota's cash flow and budget choices, and that pressure is exactly why Washington is doing it. So here's the question I want you holding in your mind from the start. Is this a disciplined, evidence-based enforcement action aimed at fraud, or is it a leverage tactic that risks turning vulnerable people into collateral damage? In the next section, I'll lay out what's confirmed, and I'll show you the paper trail that suggests this didn't begin today. But first, if you're here for fact-first reporting, subscribe now so you don't miss critical updates. Let's separate the noise from the record. Reuters reports that CMS Administrator Dr. Mehmet said the federal government paused payment of $259 million in deferred Medicaid payments to Minnesota after an audit, and that the funds will be held until the state proposes what he called a comprehensive corrective action plan. Reuters also reports Oz said Minnesota Governor Tim Walz has 60 days to respond. HHS, in a press release the same day, described the move as deferring $259.5 million of quarterly federal Medicaid funding in Minnesota to prevent payment of questionable claims while further investigation is completed. So that's the confirmed action and timeline: a pause, a corrective plan requirement, and a 60-day clock. But here is the part that changes how you should understand the story. Today's announcement fits into an ongoing federal compliance and oversight dispute that appears to have been building for weeks. In January, CMS published a Notice of Opportunity for Hearing in the Federal Register regarding the compliance of Minnesota's state plan provisions, describing the agency's intention to review and negotiate an acceptable corrective action plan and monitor progress closely. And Minnesota's own Department of Human Services issued a statement in mid-January saying it was appealing a Trump administration decision to withhold over $2 billion in annual Medicaid funding for Minnesota, linked to allegations by CMS leadership that Minnesota had not taken sufficient actions to fight fraud. Now, you don't have to take Minnesota's word for it or Washington's word for it. The point is simply that the record shows a dispute already in motion, and today's $259 million pause is part of that broader pressure campaign. So the confirmed bucket looks like this. Federal officials paused roughly $259 million in deferred Medicaid reimbursement to Minnesota. They want a comprehensive corrective action plan. They've put a 60-day deadline on the governor's response. And this dispute sits inside a longer-running compliance fight already visible in federal notices and Minnesota's appeal. Now we go to the next bucket, what the administration says it found, and what that language does and does not prove. Because the word fraud sells headlines. But fraud is also a legal claim, and if it's real, it should be provable. In the next section, I'll tell you the numbers being cited, and I'll explain why some of those numbers may be less definitive than they sound. Now here's what's being claimed, not what's been proven in court, not what's been fully audited in public, but what the administration is citing to justify the pause. Axios reports the Trump administration is freezing $259 million in Medicaid funding to Minnesota, and cites a recent review that it says revealed $243.8 million in potentially fraudulent claims in the final quarter of fiscal year 2025, along with $15.4 million in improper claims linked to individuals lacking required immigration status. Let's be precise with language. Potentially fraudulent is a serious allegation, but it is not the same as proven fraud, and improper claims can refer to a range of issues, from eligibility documentation problems to administrative errors depending on the category. Reuters' report centers on the pause following an audit and the demand for a corrective action plan, and HHS frames the pause as a measure to prevent payment of questionable claims while further investigation is completed. Now zoom out. The administration is not presenting this as a one-state fight. The CMS press release and HHS release also announced a crackdown on healthcare fraud that includes a 6-month moratorium on new Medicare enrollment for certain durable medical equipment, prosthetics, orthotics, and supply suppliers, DMEPOS, describing that as part of a broader strategy. Fierce Healthcare also reported on the CMS initiatives aimed at cracking down on fraud, including the DME supplier enrollment moratorium and continued oversight of Minnesota's corrective action plan efforts. So, the administration's narrative is, Minnesota is a case study of program integrity failure. Washington is stepping in, pausing reimbursement, forcing a corrective plan. And this is a preview of a wider national push against fraud and suspicious billing. If you're a supporter of the Trump administration, this is the strongest version of the argument. Taxpayers shouldn't be forced to subsidize sloppy controls, and states shouldn't get a blank check. But to earn trust, even from supporters, an enforcement crackdown has to answer one crucial question. Where are the receipts? Because it's one thing to say we found potentially fraudulent claims. It's another to show which programs, which providers, which billing patterns, which referrals were made, and what recoveries or prosecutions follow. That's not a liberal demand. That's not a conservative demand. That's an American demand. Prove it. Now, to be fair, Minnesota is not sitting there saying, "We don't care." Minnesota's leaders say they've been tightening controls and pushing back on what they call misleading or false claims. And that brings us to the other side of the story, Minnesota's response and the reforms already underway. In the next section, I'll lay out what Minnesota says it's doing, including enrollment freezes in high-risk categories, and I'll show you why that matters for judging Washington's move. Now let's hear Minnesota's side, because if you're going to hold power accountable, you don't pick one power center and give the other a pass. Minnesota's Department of Human Services said in January it is appealing a decision by the Trump administration to withhold over $2 billion in annual Medicaid funding, and it laid out a list of program integrity steps it says it has been taking since October 2024 to stop fraud, identify risks, and harden programs against bad actors. Minnesota has also created a fact-check page under its Program Integrity Division to rebut what it calls misleading information and outright false claims about Medicaid fraud in Minnesota, including stating that shocking claims about half of all Medicaid payments for some services being fraudulent are unsupported, and arguing that if there is evidence of fraud, the state should be given the information so it can stop payments immediately. That's Minnesota essentially saying, "Show us what you've got and we'll act. But don't paint with a broad brush." Now, there's also evidence Minnesota has been making concrete moves in high-risk areas. A Minnesota DHS provider news bulletin from late December 2025 says the department will freeze new provider enrollments in 13 categories of Medicaid services considered high risk for fraud, and that the department was working with CMS to implement the freeze. And Minnesota's Attorney General announced fraud charges in January involving a Medicaid provider, and described the case as connected to programs identified as high risk. So, on the ground, Minnesota is pointing to ongoing enforcement and prosecutions at the state level, enrollment freezes in categories it deems high risk, and efforts to rebut what it calls misinformation while demanding specifics from the federal government. Now, does that settle the argument? No, because the existence of reforms doesn't automatically mean the system is under control, and the existence of federal allegations doesn't automatically mean they're fair or properly targeted. This is why the next detail is the most important detail in the entire story, and it's the detail that too many commentators skip because it requires nuance. The difference between fraud and improper payments. In the next section, I'll explain why improper payment measurements often track documentation failures, not criminal schemes, and why that matters for how you judge Washington's move, even if you support it. If you're conservative, the principle is simple. Taxpayer money demands clean books. Medicaid can be compassionate and strict, but strict only works if it's precise. Here's the nuance most people miss. CMS itself reports that a large share of Medicaid improper payments is often driven by insufficient documentation, which CMS says is generally not indicative of fraud or abuse. CMS FY 2025 Improper Payments, Fact Sheet, KFF Summary. So when Washington says fraud, the public deserves clarity. Are we talking criminal billing schemes? Or documentation eligibility failures being treated like fraud for leverage? Supporters of the Trump administration can back this action the right way by demanding 4 things from Washington. Define the target. Which programs? Which claim types? What control failures? Show the enforcement pipeline. Referrals, suspensions, recoveries, convictions, the scoreboard. Protect patients from crossfire. Deferred reimbursement hits state budgets first, but budgets can hit access later. Apply the same standard to every state, red or blue. And Minnesota has its own burden too. If the state says it's already cracking down, it should show outcomes. Money prevented, providers removed, fraud cases built, and how quickly the system flags bad claims. Here's what I'm watching next. What Minnesota submits in its corrective action plan and whether CMS accepts it. Reuters. How the federal compliance process plays out, including the hearing compliance framework already visible in federal notices. Federal Register. And the only thing that truly settles this. Results. Verified fraud stopped, money recovered, bad actors prosecuted. If you want follow-ups as the documents drop, subscribe to the Grant Caldwell Report and comment one answer. Should Washington be able to pause deferred reimbursements to force reforms, or should it have to show stronger public proof first?